When I was writing my first book, I concluded in the book that the CIA is nothing less than the secret political police of international foreign policy. That is the foreign policy of the United States. And it means the formation of death squads. It means the disappearances of people by the tens of thousands during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And it has a very special, determined, that is, a particular task. And that task is what I was doing during those 12 years I was in the CIA. My first contact with the CIA came as I was finishing my undergraduate students in the university in the United States. This is 1956. I turned them down because I was going on to study law, which I did at the University of Florida. I had some free time in January of 1957. So a friend and I came to Havana to visit for the first time. I was here for a week or 10 days maybe, and I loved it. So I get back to the States, and I start thinking about working in places like this for the CIA, and working in places like Havana for the CIA, with the exotic culture and so forth, in secret operations against the communists. Big thing in those days. This is the mid-1950s. And so I wrote to the CIA asking to be reconsidered. 6 months later, I was in the CIA. When I was in the CIA in the 1960s, we were involved in the overthrow of various civilian governments and the installation of military dictatorships. There had been a very interesting and progressive political development in Guatemala from 1948 with the overthrow of a military dictatorship and the installation of democratic governments for the first time ever in Guatemalan history. They carried out literacy campaigns, and they tried to install an agrarian reform program that affected the lands of the United Fruit Company, based in Boston. It happened at the law firm of the United Fruit Company in Boston. It included as partners John Foster Dulles, who was then the Secretary of State, and his brother Allen Dulles, who was then the director of the CIA. Together, on behalf of United Fruit, they convinced Eisenhower to overthrow the progressive government in Guatemala, which they did, that is, the CIA did, in 1954. From the very beginning, President Truman determined that the CIA would be involved also in the interference in the internal political affairs of other countries. This has been undertaken by the United States and many countries around the world. Irregular and guerrilla warfare also has that purpose, and it was seen very clearly, for example, in Nicaragua in the 1980s, that the amount of suffering and damage that the CIA created and supported Contras had caused throughout the countryside in Nicaragua, that eventually in the 1990 elections, Nicaraguans voted for relief and voted in the traditional political forces that had existed since before the Sandinista movement had taken over. That has not happened in Cuba.
No nos engañemos creyendo que en lo adelante todo será fácil. Quizás en lo adelante todo sea más difícil.
For the entire period after the beginning of the revolutionary process, then, 1959, Cuba has been the victim of an undeclared war which has taken many different forms. There has been terrorism in large amounts. There has been paramilitary raids. There have been attacks from the sea. There has been sabotage campaigns. You can ask the question, why would the United States do this? Why wouldn't they just leave Cuba alone to develop its own political form and its own society? Why have to meddle in this country's affairs and try to destroy this revolutionary process through 10 presidencies at least in the United States? To understand this, I think, briefly, you have to go back to the period of the independence movements in Latin America. One should recall that the Latin American revolutionary movements for their independence from Spain occurred during the period roughly from 1810 to 1820. By the 1820s, all of Latin America, save Cuba and Puerto Rico, plus the British and the French and the Dutch colonies, had obtained their independence. The United States at that time was opposed to the independence of Cuba because they were afraid that Cuba would become another black republic, as Haiti had done at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. During the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, when the abolitionist movement in the United States had taken hold, there was, of course, conflict over whether Cuba, if it came into the republic, should be a slave state or a non-slave state. And one can say that every president since Jefferson, all through the 19th century, tried to take control of Cuba in one way or another. But the United States' obsession with Cuba as a strategic island on the soft underbelly of the United States at their entrance to the Gulf and the entrance to the Caribbean meant that Cuba was essential for U.S. national security. And this has been the doctrine all through these years. This all ended in January of 1959, when the United States-backed Batista military government was overthrown. One has to remember that this Batista government, from 1952 until the end of 1958, was one of the nastiest of the nasty dictatorships throughout Latin America that the United States has supported. The United States believed and still believes that it has a role to play here, that Cuba should be under the control of the United States for U.S. national security purposes. But it's also because of the continuing manifest destiny that comes out in U.S. foreign policy year after year. It comes out with the missionary nature, the evangelical nature of the U.S. political system, with the belief that we are the essence of good, and that we have to spread this good to other peoples. All of these programs in the early 1960s and extending through the 1960s were, in one form or another, a policy of state-sponsored terrorism against Cuba. When I was in the CIA's operations training program, before I went first to South America, in 1960, I was at a secret CIA training base called Camp Perry, which is just outside Williamsburg, Virginia. And at this training base, we were taught to run and develop secret operations and all the ways to keep them secret, what is known in the business as tradecraft. Among the subject matter were explosions, that is, the use of explosions, of incendiary devices, of weapons, and so forth. And I remember in March of 1960, our instructors in sabotage could not conceal their happiness, their glee, when the news got back from Havana of the destruction of the French cargo vessel, Le Coubre, in Havana Harbor. It was unloading a shipment of arms from Belgium when there was a huge explosion, which killed the crew and the stevedores doing the unloading. The fire brigade came along with militia to try to put out this enormous blaze, which was occurring at a wharf right next to the main Havana railway station. And about an hour after the first explosion, another and even larger explosion occurred, which killed the fire brigade people and the militia that were assisting in putting out the fire. Altogether, more than 100 people were killed in that blast, and hundreds were injured. If you drive down along the Port Avenue right now to the main railway station, on the left, right where that ship was docked, there is a sculpture made of scrap steel, which was taken from the ship, and it includes the rudder. It is a memorial now, and since then, to all those people who died in that CIA sabotage operation. I went down to Ecuador toward the end of 1960, and I was there working as an operations officer based in the United States Embassy, undercover as a political officer and assistant attaché. And I remember very well that a week or so before the Bay of Pigs invasion, the news came out from Havana that the most important, the largest, and recognized as the best department store in this city was burned down. It was called El Encanto, and I had shopped there on my first trip to Havana in early 1957. That too was a CIA sabotage operation, and it was carried out through the confection of dolls made of an incendiary powder, made to look exactly like dolls that the department store sold. And at the given time, these dolls exploded. I worked with this incendiary material. It was like a powder, but when you set it off, it was a huge explosion, like a bomb practically. Well, one woman was killed in that sabotage operation, was killed in the blaze, and her name was Fe del Valle. Now, every time I drive up Galeano on my way to Chinatown for lunch, for example, I pass Fe del Valle Park, which is where El Encanto once stood and where it stood when I shopped there in 1957. Altogether, during this 45-year war against Cuba, undeclared war against Cuba, nearly 3,500 Cubans have been killed. More than 2,000 Cubans have been disabled for life.
Me la arrebató Fidel Castro y con la complicidad de la Unión Soviética y de una prensa adulatoria que a nivel...
From the 1980s until well into the 21st century, Cuban-American extremists of the first generation of immigrants has been controlling United States policy toward Cuba. And this policy is of the most extremist and uncompromising type. They are insistent that Americans not be allowed to travel to Cuba. They are insistent that every measure be taken to undermine and to squeeze and to destroy the Cuban economy. Economic warfare is another example of how this undeclared war against Cuba has been carried out. And the purpose of this economic warfare, which has never really ended, is to squeeze the people. That is, to turn them against the revolution, to make them suffer to the point where they will tire of it and they will turn against the revolution. That's the point of economic warfare, because it is meant to affect the whole population and not just, let's say, the government or the revolutionary leadership or the Revolutionary Party, for example. But where Cuba is concerned, these operations to develop a political opposition received major emphasis from the 1990s on into the 21st century. And AID in recent years, this is, let's say, from 1998 on, has spent nearly $30 million on Cuban programs. And most of this money is paid to support what has become a cottage industry of NGOs, most of them based in Miami. All of these things have been carried out against Cuba through the years. And until the United States determines that Cuba should have a right to make its own decisions on the type of political and social system that it wants, these things are going to continue. By the time the Batista dictatorship was overthrown, the Cubans knew what to expect from the United States. They knew the United States would try to repeat here in Cuba what they had successfully carried out in Guatemala 5 years earlier. Che, of course, was part of the revolution here, and he knew what had happened in Guatemala, so did the rest of the leadership, and so they knew they had to be prepared for aggression from the United States. As recent as April 2003, the South Florida Sun-Sentinel, based in Fort Lauderdale, carried a large reporting section on the training outside Miami in the Everglades of a group called the F4 Commandos. And there are photographs in this reportage that show these people, Cuban exiles, in combat gear, combat uniforms, carrying assault weapons, and training for commando raids against Cuba. This is the situation that Cuba is faced with in Miami. So naturally, if they send their own people to Miami to report back here as early as possible on the planning of terrorist activities, such as the bombing of tourist hotels here. A whole campaign was carried out in the late 1990s against hotels in order to try to scare tourists away from Cuba. The Cubans eventually caught these people, and they were Central American mercenaries hired by one of the most notorious of the Cuban terrorists, a man trained by the CIA, a man who worked for years for the CIA, and who continued through the years to carry out terrorist attacks against Cuban targets. This man's name is Luis Posada Carriles. One of the most notorious terrorist acts of this man, Luis Posada Carriles, was his help in the planning of the bombing of a Cuban commercial airliner in early October 1976, in which all 73 people on board were killed. He has a litany that stretches through the years. He was eventually arrested by Venezuelan authorities and charged with that crime.
Usted fue el que las pensó, el que las organizó y el que mandó a la gente para que las pusieran.
Yo de cualquier hecho dentro del territorio cubano en contra del régimen de La Habana me responsabilizo totalmente.
But he escaped from prison, and in the early 1980s he showed up in El Salvador, where he began work at the Ilopango Air Base outside San Salvador in the CIA's resupply operations to the Contras operating in Nicaragua. Another of the most famous of the CIA-trained Cuban terrorists is a pediatrician named Orlando Bosch. Orlando Bosch has a record going back to the 1960s of dozens of terrorist activities. He too was working with Posada Carriles in the bombing of the Cuban airliner in 1976. He was arrested by the Venezuelans. He was tried 3 times, and 3 times on technicalities he was acquitted. Of course, all the money for the support for Bosch and for the, let's say, the springing from prison of Posada Carriles came from these extremist Cuban Americans in Miami around the Cuban American National Foundation. In 1987, the Venezuelans released Bosch, and he left the country. He turns up in the United States, I believe it's in February of 1988. He's immediately arrested on charges stemming from a parole violation of a conviction, or on a conviction from a previous terrorist act in the United States. The next year, 1989, or from that time on, the Department of Justice creates a report showing that he is a known terrorist. They list these terrorist acts. In this document, there were 30 terrorist acts, and it was the justification for his expulsion from the United States as an undesirable. He was on the verge of being expelled from the United States in early 1990, when another of the Cuban extremists in Miami, this time it's the Congresswoman, Ileana Ros-Latinen, begins to lobby on his behalf, that is on Bosch's behalf, with then President Bush, the father, to quash the deportation order. The main support that she has is from her campaign manager, the man responsible for her election to the Congress in Washington, who is none other than Jeb Bush, the son of the then president and future governor of Florida. So between the two of them, they prevail on the father, George Bush Sr., to quash the deportation order in 1990 against Orlando Bosch. He is set free, and he's been walking the streets of Miami ever since, a free man. But he has never renounced terrorism.
Hay derecho a derribar aviones, a hundir barcos, a hundir submarinos, a hacer cualquier cosa.
Posada Carriles was arrested in Panama in the year 2000, along with 3 other very well-known CIA-trained terrorists, sabotage experts. They were captured, or they were arrested, with a large amount of, I believe it was C4 explosive, enough to have killed hundreds, if not more than 1,000 people. Their plan was to explode a bomb at the auditorium where Fidel Castro was to be speaking at the University of Panama during the Ibero-American Summit. In fact, he was arrested just at the time the conference was beginning. One of the most interesting aspects of the arrest of Posada Carriles and the other 3 in Panama in 2000 was the role that the Cuban intelligence service played in these arrests. It happens that they were on the trail of these guys from somewhere in Central America. It's never been revealed. But all through their stay in Panama, they knew the remote farm where these guys were holed up with their explosives. And they knew the hotels where they were staying. So that when Fidel Castro went to this summit meeting, where the King of Spain was present, when the president of the Spanish government was there, and the chiefs of state of all of the Latin American countries, or the Spanish-speaking countries, were also present. When Fidel arrived for this conference, he immediately gave a press conference. And in this press conference, he gave out all this information about these terrorists.
Posada Carriles arribó a Panamá el 5 de noviembre con documentación falsa y sin ningún disfraz. Tiene en Panamá cómplices de su entera confianza, en los cuales se apoya. Una copia del caballero. Estamos pidiendo la cooperación del pueblo.
They were then immediately arrested by the Panamanian police. And they were then held under arrest for years until they were finally brought to trial. But it was a tremendous coup for the Cuban intelligence service, and simply reminded me of when I was in the CIA. The Cuban intelligence service was a very important target for us to penetrate. As far as I know, the Cuban service was never penetrated by an agent of the CIA who was on the inside of that service. And they have tried, I tried myself, in many different ways to penetrate this service, by recruiting their people, by trying to break their codes, to get their code pads from embassies and so forth. And I have no doubt at all that in the 21st century, they continue to be very high on the list of priorities for penetration by the CIA. I went into the CIA with tremendous enthusiasm. I was 22 years old, and I went through 3 years of training. Then some time working in the Western Hemisphere, or the Latin America division of the CIA Operations Directorate in Washington, before going down toward the end of 1960 to work out of the United States Embassy in Quito as an assistant political attaché. It was nothing unusual for a young man like me, patriotic, conformist, coming from a comfortable family, to go into government service. And so I went into the CIA for adventure. I was only 22, and I had romantic views toward things. And it wasn't until I got down to Ecuador and had been working there for a year or two that I began to get a political education. You can't deny what you see as you drive your car down the street or out in the countryside. I traveled a lot around the countryside of Ecuador in a Land Rover. I saw the injustices all around me in terms of the social system, the political system, the economic system, and this affected me. When I got to Mexico in the middle of 1967, a year and a half before the Olympic Games, they have assigned this woman as the representative of the organizing committee of the Olympic Games to work with the United States Embassy on the cultural program. And in the fall of 1967, and about a week into October, we were having dinner, and suddenly she explodes. She starts to scream using the most unrepeatable language about this CIA that had murdered Che Guevara in Bolivia. It had just been announced that day. So I'm sitting at the table. She doesn't know I'm a CIA officer. I knew what had happened, and I knew that the CIA had a man there at the moment of Che's assassination. That's Felix Rodriguez, a Cuban, who worked for the CIA. So I knew all this. I'm sitting there at the table thinking to myself, man, you got to decide. You can't do both. You got to choose. I left the CIA with the idea of forgetting it all and starting a new life. But you don't forget these things. And so from my resignation on, I remembered all of the way the CIA operates, the things that I did. And I'm not the only person who has written on his career. I started it all. But there have been dozens of others who have followed. And I've read their books, and nothing changes through the years. It all continues more or less the same.